something about your grandparents. I'll tell you what I know about them. Uh, Martha Wittenbach Gerber came to Wisconsin in 1911. She came to work as a housekeeper for her brother Fred, who had a big stock farm near Maysmany, Wisconsin. Uncle Fred owned that farm with two other Swiss men. Um, Mom Gerber's parents were Marie Anna Eyre Wittenbach, and the father was Christian Wittenbach. They lived in Gerzensee, Switzerland. They built the new home that is on a very high mountain in Switzerland. It's so high that the family call it the Saddle. Mom Gerber had many brothers and sisters. Those who came to Wisconsin were Fred, Franz, Chris, John, Carl, and his sister Catherine. Franz didn't like Wisconsin and stayed only a year. Then he returned to his native Switzerland. Chris and John bought a big farm in Waukesha County, and after they were on the farm a few years, a younger brother, Carl, came to work with them. But Carl didn't stay well very long. He got pneumonia, and he was injured by a bull and died the same year that Carl Gerber was born. In fact, Uncle Carl died early in November, and our brother Carl was born later in November. The sister Catherine, a very lovely, shy young lady, got tuberculosis after she was here just a few years. She was married to Fritz Gasser. They came to farm on a little farm over at Glendale. When Aunt Catherine got too ill, they went down to Uncle Chris and John, whose farm was near the Wisconsin TV Sanitarium, and Aunt Catherine died there. She had a little boy, Fritz, and a little girl, Kathy. Kathy also got tuberculosis and died and is buried in Waukesha, where Aunt Catherine is buried. But Uncle Fred Gasser was so grieved over these deaths that he took the little boy Fritz and went back to Switzerland. And I have met Fritz in later years, and he's a very fine man whose other relatives gave him a very good education. He is printer and editor of a paper near Bern. Our dad, Ernest Christian Gerber, came to Wisconsin in July 1909. He came to work in a cheese factory in Greene County near the city of Monroe, where his older brother Paul was working in a cheese factory. Dad Gerber really didn't think he was going to be a cheesemaker because he took a course in gardening and landscaping in Paris, France, where he spent several years. He learned basic French, but then when he heard how well his brother was doing in Wisconsin, he decided to join him. Dad Gerber realized that he had to learn how to make cheese the very best way possible. So he went for a year, or part of a year, to the University of Wisconsin Ag School. They called it the short course then, and this is where he learned cheese making. His parents in Switzerland were Anna Wise Hanny Gerber. Wise was Grandma Gerber's maiden name. It's spelled W-Y-S-N. Hanny, H-A-N-N-I, was the name of her first husband. Then she married a Gerber. The grandfather Gerber's name was just like Dad Gerber's name, Ernest Christian Gerber. Their home was in Thierachten, Canton, Bern, Switzerland. Thierachten is spelled Thieracten. After Grandpa Gerber learned how to make cheese, he continued working for several different cheese factories in Greene County, but then for 1 year he went down to Orangeville, Illinois, where he operated a cheese factory himself. He didn't own it, but he ran it for someone else. While the family was back up at Monroe, Walter and Ernest were born. I should tell you that Grandma and Grandpa were married in December 1913 in Monroe, Wisconsin, and that's where their older sons Walter and Ernest were born. When we went down to Orangeville, Melanie was born down there. Grandma always remembered that Melanie's doctor never asked her name, never registered her birth, and so when the family left Illinois for Wisconsin, Melanie didn't have a birth certificate until she was quite a young lady. And it was a little hard trying to find out where she was born and to whom she belonged. The family realized that it is to their advantage to own their own business. So Dad Gerber decided that he should look for a new territory to build and start his own cheese factory. He heard about the small farms that were being started in the northern part of Wisconsin and how few cheese factories they were up there. So he decided to take the Sioux Line train and look around the northern part of the state. He rode the Sioux Line train to New Murray, where he got off, walked around the town by himself, found his way out to Old Murray, which is now along Highway 40. He liked the hills that he saw out there. He visited with different people as best he could with his new English language and met people who were real interested in having a little cheese factory in their community. So he bought the property where he built his cheese factory. Ernie Gerber has the deed to that property and all the details around that deed. So this was in 1917. Then Dad Gerber went back down to Orangeville, Illinois, and finished out the contract of his work for that cheese factory, and moved up in 1918. In that spring, local men began building the factory for him. The cheese factory was built by Gordon Bernard, and local men like Selmer Elvey helped with concrete work. While the cheese factory was being built, Mom Gerber and the three little ones lived in a house that was in what is now Walt Gerber's cornfield. It was a home that was owned by Adam and Addie Cooey. But not far from this little house was the Riverby Hotel, which was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Seaver Surley, Ida and Mamie Surley's parents. They owned the hotel, but it was run for them by Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Kittleson. And those people were very, very good to Mom and Dad Gerber. They helped them with food, they helped them with friendliness, they helped them in every way they could. In later years, Dad Gerber bought that hotel and made a barn out of it. This is Walt Gerber's barn now. In the fall of the year of 1918, when the rooms were finished upstairs over the cheese factory, then Mom Gerber and the children moved up there. When Dad Gerber began making cheese in June of 1918, he had to borrow money to pay the farmers. The Bruce Bank would not lend him any money because they didn't know if he was a good risk or not. But he went to to Ladysmith. One of the banks there talked to him, and they decided he was a good risk. So they paid for the farmer's milk all summer long until in November, when Grandpa Gerber's first cheese was ready to be sold on the market. Grandpa inquired around as to where he would get the most for his summer's cheese. Someone advised him to pack it all in wooden boxes, rent a Sioux Line car over at New Murray, and go to Chicago with it and find a buyer in the big city. They heard that city people like the northern Wisconsin cheese. So Grandpa did that. He loaded his whole summer's cheese, went down on the Sioux Line, and he knew a wrestler down there by the name of Mr. Aaron. When he got to Chicago, he called Mr. Aaron up and said, "I need some help. I'm here with a load of cheese, and I need to find a cheese buyer." Mr. Aaron said, "That's just fine. I'm going to bring you a cheese buyer, and you just stay right there. I'll be there." They went to the box car that was put on a sidetrack, and they opened that box car, opened a case of the cheese, which was brick cheese and Limburger cheese. The cheese buyer took a sample of it. He said, "Open up another box." They did that. He said, "I will take the whole carload. Very good cheese. I'll take the whole carload." And he paid him a very good price, which was a lucky break for Dad Gerber, because shortly afterwards the cheese dropped 10 cents a pound, which would have made an awful difference with such a big load of cheese. So Grandpa Gerber could come home and pay off the debt that he had with his bank in Ladysmith. Grandpa said that it took, now let me see, maybe you'd like to know a little bit something more about the hotel there at Riverby, they called it. Now, that hotel was first built by Mr. Seaver Surley late in the 1800s. The first hotel was a 3-story hotel. It was built on the Chippewa River near what is now Highway 40. It was built as a stopping place for loggers, and especially when they had the log drives down the Chippewa River. The first hotel burned in 1914. Ida Surley gave me these facts. Then Mr. Surley had that hotel built again, and he himself hauled the lumber home from Chippewa Falls with a 4-horse team. Mr. Surley was a logger and preferred logging to running the hotel. This is why he got Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Surley to operate it for him. And Mr. Surley went back on his homestead there and started it and did logging back there, the homestead that now belongs to Jim Surley. Grandma and Grandpa Gerber were among the newer settlers in the town of Murray, because the LeBlaws had been there since the late 1800s, and of course the Surleys were there, also the Piddlesons. The Jack Ryan family came there from Eau Claire in the early 1900s, and they were the most wonderful people. They were Irish, but they befriended Grandma and Grandpa just so very much. And after Mr. Ryan died, Mrs. Ryan wanted Grandpa Gerber to have the 120 acres that were sort of toward the north of her property. So Grandpa went with Helen and Lucy Ryan to Ladysmith, and they completed the deal. Then the Ryans went back to live in Eau Claire. But they were among the people who were the kindest to the Gerber family. In fact, Mr. Ryan had a wonderful team of horses with a beautiful cutter. He would like to give Grandpa Gerber rides to Exlon and to Bruce in his cutter. One time, Grandpa and Mr. Ryan went to Bruce. On the way home, it was late at night, and their cutter tipped over near the Anderson brothers' farm. Mr. Ryan was a big Irish man. Dad fell out, and Mr. Ryan on top of him. They always laugh about it afterwards because, of course, the snow was heavy then. Ryan's had one of the first Ford sedans in the town of Murray. They would often invite Grandma to come up in the evenings, but they would never let her walk home. They always gave her a ride home in their Ford sedan. Dad owned a Model T down in Orangeville, Illinois. It was a 1916 model, but of course he left it there when he moved the family up on the train. He didn't go for his Model T until the next year. He told me that the trip to Bruce took 4 days. He stopped overnight at Fred Wittenbach's in Sauk City. He stayed overnight at New Lisbon, Wisconsin, and he stayed overnight at Prentice, Wisconsin, because he got stuck in the mud there. He had to get a team of horses late at night to pull him out, but the man didn't want any pay. He said that he would come sometime to Dad's cheese factory and he would ask for a free brick of cheese. And I hope that he did that someday. Dad's Model T was the second one in the town of Murray. Walter Fillion owned a 1915 Model T. Mr. Stanley Sr. Poff of Exlon also had one of the first Fords. Mr. Poff was very generous about giving other early settlers rides to town whenever they had business or important things to do. Talking about the early neighbors who all especially loved Grandma Gerber because she could speak French with them. The LeBlancs were French Canadians who came from Quebec up in Canada. Because Mom said that the French language was very, very easy for her to learn. She had gone to Paris when she was about 16 to tutor children in the German language. This was in the home of wealthy French people. They were very satisfied with her teaching the German language to their children, and she learned French from them. She did not want to lose the ability to speak French language, so the LeBlancs always gave her their newspapers and magazines, which they got from Quebec. And Mr. Joe LeBlanc, who lived where John Fillion's live now, always came up to visit Grandma Gerber so that she could have someone to speak French to. So that way she kept up on the language until after the older LeBlancs died, and then she didn't have anyone to speak French with anymore. The Gerber children learned Swiss German in their home. Walter, Ernest, and Melanie could not speak English when they started school, but it didn't take them very long to learn it from the other children. And Grandma and Grandpa Gerber learned a lot of English from the children. Also, Grandma and Grandpa learned a lot of the English language from the Sears Roebuck catalog. Talking about the Murray School, the first school in the town of Murray was a log building that was built down past Eddie Heff's to the north. It was north of the bridge, a little south of Herman LeBlanc's. When that building was no longer usable, the second school building was a red log building again in Walter Gerber's cornfield. It wasn't far from the River By Hotel. When that was no longer usable, the third Murray School building was the one that was very close to the cheese factory. In fact, it was built on an acre of ground that was taken out of the land that Grandpa Gerber later bought for his cheese factory. School was discontinued there in don't know the date, and Grandpa Gerber bought the building, moved it down to near the barn, and it is now Walter Gerber's home. Walter Gerber has the abstract for the farm, which Grandpa Gerber then bought in later years. The first property that he bought to build his cheese factory on wasn't a very large parcel, but when Mr. B.F. Brainerd was ready to sell the property to the south of the cheese factory, Grandpa Gerber was able to make a very good deal with him. He was very fond of Mr. B.H. Brainerd because Mr. Brainerd was honest and direct. He was a gruff man, but he gave Grandpa very good advice about things in this country. The Brainards had been here for many, many years before the Gerber family came, so Grandpa always appreciated the advice he got from someone who knew what he was talking about. Even though the Gerber family didn't belong to the Catholic Church, we had a great deal of respect for it, and the children were taught that it was all right to go and sit on the steps of the church, but never were we ever to go into the church, even though the church was left open. The little church became very dear to us as we always lived close to it. It was St. Anne's Church that was started in July 1889. Waldo Brainerd said that that church was built by the Catholics and non-Catholic people of the community. And there was a time when there were about 50 Leblaws in the Murray community, and they all belonged to that church. St. Anne's at Murray had their anniversary date on August 7th in 1980, and died on March 1st, 1975. His funeral was in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, and he was buried at Sauk City. Our mother, Martha Gerber, was born June 17, 1890. She died on June 30th, 1968. Her funeral was at Nathaniel Lutheran Church in Bruce, and she is buried in the Bruce Cemetery. Dad Gerber, his birthday was October 7th, 1885, and he died September 21st, 1972. His funeral was at Nathaniel Lutheran Church, and he was buried in the Bruce Cemetery.
Why? No, turn it off, she said.
Stick it in there.
Okay.
Now, here's some little facts, Marna, that you may be interested in. When Grandpa began making cheese in June 1918, he only had 650 pounds of milk. It was barely enough to cover the first vat. By September 18th of that year, he had 3,000 pounds coming in, because as farmers heard about the new cheese factory and as they became acquainted with Grandpa, they got real interested in bringing their milk to his little cheese factory. 13 pounds of cheese could be made from 100 pounds of milk. Sam Kramer built or redug the well that was in the cheese factory. It was a 40-foot well in spring water. To this day, that well has never failed. It has always produced good spring water. Now, something else that's interesting are the cheese factories that were in Russ County at the time that the little farms were springing up. The first cheese factory, as far as Grandpa Gerber knows, was over at Sentinel Ash. And Grandpa's friend, another Swiss, Mr. Gobeli, was the cheesemaker there. Grandpa thinks that the second cheese factory was over at Apollonia. The Old Murray Cheese Factory, which was Grandpa's, was the third cheese factory. A fourth cheese factory was down at Elder Creek. This was by the Gerber's good friend, Ernest Wittrick. Their family was quite a bit like the Gerber family. They had 9 children, and we visited back and forth very often. Mr. and Mrs. Wittrick, came from very near the same part of Switzerland as Grandma and Grandpa Gerber. Grandpa said that the Katy Lake Cheese Factory and the Exon Cheese Factories were begun quite some years after the Old Murray Cheese Factory. Grandpa realized that more cattle were needed in the area if his business was to grow. So he went down to Alma Center and he bought a whole herd of Holstein cattle. He brought them up on the Sioux Line train and sold them to farmers on consignment. His project was backed by the Pioneer National Bank of Ladysmith. On one trip, he took just enough money along to pay for the cattle, but not for his lunch. When the train stopped in Ladysmith, he told me that he got off the train, he went to the bank to get $1 so he could have a meal. Uncle John and Chris Wittenbach came to us about 1925. Chris stayed with us at the cheese factory 6 or 7 years. This was after Grandpa had bought the farm. He worked on the farm, and he used to be the one who would drive with the team over to New Murray to the depot to take those loads of cheese that were being put on the car and sent to Chicago. It used to be a lot of fun for the children to ride along with Uncle Chris as he drove through the shortcut and would have to go quite fast when he heard the train whistle blow as it left Axland, and he knew that he had to be over by the depot in time to put the load of cheese on the noon train. The school and the teachers were very important to the family. Some of the early teachers that Walt, Ernest, and Melanie had were Miss Lancaster from south of Bruce, David Lyons, Violet Crawford, Alice Ward, Raymond Gotham, and Genevieve Taylor. Someone who was a very good friend and helped Grandpa Gerber through a hard time was a Mr. George Christensen, who used to own the Claude Bartlett farm up near Axland. Mr. Christensen was a representative for the Farm Sales and Mortgage Company of Milwaukee. He was the one who helped Dad get a government loan so that he could buy the property that was south of the cheese factory. The mortgage was $3,500, and I don't remember how many years the mortgage was written for, but our dad paid that off in 3 years. But he always felt that it was Mr. Christensen's advice and arrangement that helped him to get the farm property. Our dad was town chairman and on the county board for a number of years. Some of the things that he felt were quite an accomplishment was the year that he had 36 acres of corn all up on the Ryan farm. Dad was very good with math. He did all of his book work and all of his paying the farmers by hand. He never had an adding machine. He would add those columns of 30 figures, which represented the amount of milk that the farmers brought per month. He do all of that by hand, without the use of machines. We always remember Teff LeBlanc, who was the first road patroller in the town of Murray. We would see him go by every day. He'd go by with his team and he'd grade the gravel road. Some other interesting facts that Dad told me. He said that the dam at Radisson was built by Joe Arpin. Joe Arpin was one of the lumber kings around here. Mr. Arpin spent about $500,000 on it because he thought that he would be able to stop the log drives, but he lost out. The power company won that dispute, and Mr. Arpin lost a lot of money when he built the Radisson Dam. In later years, John Craneville bought the Ryan farm, and it pleased the Gerber family because Mr. Craneville was from Switzerland, and the older Gerber children always thought that he was their grandpa. He looked like a grandpa. The family had a lot of fun doing things around the hills at Murray. One thing that was a lot of fun was sliding down the sandbank. When they built and improved the curve along Highway 40, they cut a lot of the hill away so that the east side was just bare. It was the most fun to walk up the hill and then slide all the way down the sandbank. Also a lot of fun for the family was sledding in the winter. The boys had sleds that Grandma ordered from Sears. I can remember some of the sleds had names like the Flying Arrow, King of the Hill, and Shooting Star. Walt and Ernest had the nicest little farm wagon. It had railings around the box, and it had a little high spring seat where two people could sit on that little seat there. Grandma tried to give the children as many happy times as she could with the little money that she had to spend. She would save the syrup pails and pack them with shredded wood straw around Easter time, and would put colored eggs and an orange and maybe a chocolate egg in the little syrup pail basket, and would hide them all around the house or out in the yard. There was a room on the north side of the cheese factory that was called a packing room, and it was just used for the boys to build cheese boxes. Ernest and Walter built a lot of the cheese boxes up there. Sometimes in the summertime, Grandpa would put the lumber down underneath the big porch, and the boys would build the cheese boxes down underneath there. The family did a lot of berry picking. One time, Grandma Gerber and Herman got lost. The only thing that they could think to do was to have Herman climb a big high tree and find the right direction to see which way Grandma and Herman should go home. We always had a big garden, and we canned in 2-quart jars because it took just a 2-quart jar of green beans or a 2-quart jar of peaches for a meal for the family. The boys used to hunt for arrowheads down in the cornfield because that piece of ground was a burial ground of the Indians who were there many years before that. The boys found some wonderful arrowheads there in the spring of the year when the ground would give up arrowheads. It was just the most fun to hunt for them. Grandma made a game for us on a cardboard, and it was called Fort. I think that you used, I think that we sawed little checkers from broom handles, and we used those to play this game Fort. It was just the most fun. It was a game that they had used to have in Switzerland, but Grandma never was able to buy it here, but she made it, and we spent hours and hours on that cardboard game. Grandma encouraged the family to read books. Also, she felt that she was improving her English by reading to us. She would order wonderful books from Sears Roebuck for us, like the book Heidi, and she read stories out of the Evening Telegram. A wonderful story I remember was called The Lake of Pine. It was a story of the logging around Glidden, Wisconsin. She encouraged us to read the funny papers because we enjoyed the stories, and it helped with the reading. One of the funnies that we liked the best of all was the Katzenjammer Kids. Grandpa was a great horseshoe player. He played with the boys down at the barnyard all the time. I have wonderful memories of Dad Gerber getting up almost every night during a calving time by lighting his kerosene lantern and walking down to the barn to see if everything was all right. And when he would come up with his lantern again, the different children took turns in blowing out the light that was in the lantern. All of Grandma and Grandpa's children were confirmed in Bethany Lutheran Church in Bruce. That was a very important time of our lives. We studied our lessons very well, and it was a very memorable day when each one was confirmed. Grandpa brought his belongings from Switzerland in a pine trunk. We kept that trunk for many years in the packing room because Grandpa used to go to auction sales and buy boxes of books. And the old pine trunk was such a good place to store books when you didn't have the shelves in the rooms. And always some kid was in that trunk sorting out those books. The neighbor kids also used it as sort of their borrowing library, and we had a great deal of enjoyment finding books to read in the old trunk. In later years, the trunk was painted brown, and one day Ray took a look at that and he scratched with the back of the fingernail file that he had in his pocket, and he said, "I think that there's nice wood under this." So he took all the paint off and sanded it down and varnished it, and that is the nicest pine trunk now. Margaret Brown fell in love with it, and the trunk is now in her living room. She has a nice plant on the top of it, and she just thinks it's a treasure.